Hey guys, hoping all is well with everyone. So in this video, we're going to be continuing our read aloud of Wayside School is Falling Down by Louis Sachar. And last time we finished, we completed chapter 16, so we'll be starting with chapter 17 today. And these next chapters get really wacky and can be really interesting. So I hope you guys will enjoy the read today, especially with the chapters we're looking at. But without further ado, let's jump into it. Chapter 17. What? It was purple. So Jenny read the story backward. When she finished, she threw up. Okay, said Jenny. So read the story backward, suggested Mrs. Jules. That way the beginning will be a surprise. But I already know how the story ends, Jenny complained. I only like stories with surprise endings. Good point, said Mrs. Jules. Here, you can read the story yourself. It's very funny. She gave the book to Jenny. All I heard was the last sentence, said Jenny. It isn't funny unless you know what happened first. Why aren't you laughing, Jenny? Asked Mrs. Jules. Didn't you think it was a funny story? That made Dana laugh harder. There goes the giggle box, said Myron. Everybody laughed, except for Jenny. Dana laughed hysterically. Mrs. Jules looked back at the story she had been reading before Jenny's interruption. There was only one sentence left for her to read. She read it to the class. Jenny made a face. She could still taste the awful stuff. And next time you'll drink your prune juice more quickly, said Mrs. Jules. Jenny sat down. Mrs. Jules waited for Jenny to sit down. Jenny wrote her name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Well, that's no excuse, said Mrs. Jules. Now, go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline. I couldn't leave the table until I finished it, explained Jenny. And then I missed the bus. What does prune juice have to do with anything? Asked Mrs. Jules. Because I hate prune juice, Jenny griped. Why are you late? Asked Mrs. Jules. I can't hear you, said Jenny. I'd better take off my helmet. She took off her helmet. Take off your helmet, said Mrs. Jules. What? Asked Jenny. Why are you late? Asked Mrs. Jules. Jenny caught her breath. What? She asked. She couldn't hear too well because she was still wearing the motorcycle helmet. Mrs. Jules looked up from the story she had been reading to the class. You're late, she said. She hopped off the bike in front of Wayside School and charged up the stairs. Her stomach was still going up and down as she opened the door to Mrs. Jules' room. She put on her helmet, then her father drove her to school on the back of his motorcycle. It was a very bumpy ride. Put on your helmet, said her father. I'll drive you to school on the back of my motorcycle. I missed the bus, Jenny grumbled. What are you doing home? Asked her mother. She finally got it all down, then hurried as fast as she could to the bus stop. When she got there, the bus was just pulling away. She sighed, then turned around and ran all the way back home. Her mother wouldn't let her leave the breakfast table until she finished her prune juice. It took forever. She hated prune juice more than anything in the world. One day, Jenny was late for school. Chapter 18. The Substitute. Benjamin couldn't take it any longer. Today was the day he would finally tell Mrs. Jules his real name. So what if nobody likes me, he thought. So what if I stop getting high marks? Hi, Mark, said Jason. Hi, Mark, said Stephen. Hi, he glumly replied, then started up the stairs. Hi, Mark, said Bibi, as he took his seat next to her. Guess what? We have a substitute. Yahoo! Shouted Mauricia. Everyone in Mrs. Jules' class loved it when they had substitute teachers. They loved playing mean and horrible tricks on them. Benjamin frowned. He finally had the courage to tell Mrs. Jules his real name. Rats, he said. That's a good idea, said Terence. We'll put a dead rat in her desk. Let's trick her into going outside, said Joy. Then lock her out of the room. But what if she tells Mr. Kidswatter? Asked Eric Fry. So what? Said Joy. She'll have to go all the way down to the office, then all the way back up. By then, we'll unlock the door. Mr. Kidswatter will think she's bonkers." Benjamin looked at the substitute teacher, sitting at Mrs. Jewell's desk. She looked like a nice lady. She wore tiny spectacles and had long gray hair tied in a ponytail. He felt sorry for her, and he felt sorry for himself. "I was going to tell Mrs. Jewell my name," he thought. "I really was." The substitute stood up and walked to the center of the room. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Mrs. Franklin." Nobody said good morning back to her. Kelvin handed Benjamin a note. "At 10 o'clock, drop your book on the floor. Pass it on." Benjamin read it, then passed it on to Todd. "Okay, who can tell me what page we're on?" asked Mrs. Franklin. "Page 17, called Myron. 112, said Mauricia. 98, said Eric Ovens. 3,000, said Joe. Mrs. Franklin smiled. "I guess we'll have to study all those pages," she said. Benjamin raised his hand. "Yes, the handsome young man in the red shirt," said the substitute. He told her the correct page. "We're on page 102, he said. "Thank you," said the substitute. "And what is your name, please?" Benjamin thought a moment. He looked around the room, then boldly told the truth. "My name is Benjamin," he stated proudly. Several kids snickered. "Thank you, Benjamin," said the substitute. There were more snickers. "You're welcome," said Benjamin. He felt good, even the other kids were laughing at him. Mrs. Franklin asked a question from page 102. Jason answered it correctly. "Very good," said the substitute. "And what is your name, please?" Jason looked around. "Benjamin," he asserted. Half the class giggled. "Thank you, Benjamin," said Mrs. Franklin. The other half giggled. Dana answered the next question. "And what's your name?" Mrs. Franklin asked Dana. "Benjamin," Dana blurted, then fell giggling into the floor and onto it. "Thank you, Benjamin," said the substitute. Everyone was hysterical. "My, it is certainly a pleasure to teach such happy students," said the substitute. "Who knows the answer to question 4? They all raised their hands. They all wanted to tell the substitute their names were Benjamin. They were having so much fun, they forgot to drop their books at 10 o'clock. At recess, everyone congratulated Benjamin on his great trick. "You're a genius, Mark," said Todd. "Benjamin is such a funny name," said Jason. "How'd you ever think of it?" "But my name really is Benjamin," said Benjamin. "So is mine," said Stephen. "Mine too," said Leslie. They all laughed. "Do you think she really believes we're all named Benjamin?" asked Eric Ovens. "Probably," said Joy. "She's so stupid." "If she thought we were lying, she would have gotten mad," said Eric Bacon. The bell rang, and they all hurried back to class. After recess was social studies. "Who would like to read?" asked Mrs. Franklin. Every hand went up. "Okay, Benjamin," said Mrs. Franklin as she pointed at Dana. Everyone laughed. Dana giggled a few seconds, then got control of herself and read from the book. "Thank you, Benjamin," said the substitute when Dana finished reading. "Okay, Benjamin, you may read next," she said, pointing at Terrence. Everyone laughed. It was the first time all year Terrence had volunteered to read. All day, everyone paid very close attention. They all wanted the teacher to call on them. Because as funny as it was when Mrs. Franklin called somebody else Benjamin, it was even funnier when she called you Benjamin. So everyone worked hard and listened closely. As a result, they learned more from the substitute in a day than they would usually learn from Mrs. Jewell in a month. When the final bell rang, everyone crowded around her desk. "Are you coming back tomorrow, Mrs. Franklin?" asked Eric Bacon. "Please, Mrs. Franklin, say you will," pleading Kathy. "You're the best substitute we've ever had," said Jason. The substitute smiled. School is over, she said. You don't have to call me Mrs. Franklin anymore. That sounds so formal. Since we're friends now, you may all call me by my first name. What is your first name? Asked Mauricia. The substitute gathered up her things and put them in a straw bag. Benjamin, she said, then walked out of the room. Everyone stared silently after her. Do you think that's really her name? Asked Joy. Chapter 19. A Bad Case of the Sillies. Allison started up the stairs 5 minutes before the bell rang for school to start. The stairs were completely empty. Allison liked it that way. When the bell rang, the stairs would be crammed with 1,000 screaming kids scurrying to their rooms, but now it was nice and peaceful. She walked up past the 18th story and toward the 20th. There was no 19th story in Wayside School. Mrs. Zarves taught the class on the 19th story. There was no Miss Zarves. Allison didn't understand it. If there was no 19th story, then wasn't her class really on the 29th? Suddenly, she heard footsteps charging up behind her. She turned around to see Ron and Dee Dee racing. She leaned against the wall to get out of their way, but Dee Dee stamped on her foot. Then Ron's elbow jammed her in her stomach. She grunted as she fell and rolled 3 steps. Dee Dee and Ron didn't even stop to say they were sorry. Allison slowly stood up. Fortunately, she wasn't hurt, but her windbreaker was torn. She thought Ron and Dee Dee were silly. They race up the stairs, and when they get up to Mrs. Jewell's room, they're too pooped to learn anything. Allison thought all the kids in Mrs. Jewell's class were silly, even Rondi, and Rondi was her best friend. Then there was Jason, who was always pestering her. That was because Jason hated her, or else he loved her. Allison wasn't sure which. When she got to her class, Dee Dee and Ron were sitting with their heads flat on their desks and their tongues hanging out. You could have said you were sorry, Allison said, as she walked past them. She sat straight up in her chair, folded her hands on her desk, and waited as everyone else wandered in. Jason entered the room carrying a glass bowl with a goldfish swimming inside it. Look what I brought, he said. What's the name of your goldfish? Asked Mrs. Jewls. Shark, said Jason. Everyone laughed. Allison rolled her eyes. It makes him feel important, Jason explained. Where should I put him? How about on top of the coat closet? Suggested Mrs. Jewls. Jason had to stand on a chair on his tiptoes. He held the bowl at the very bottom as he tried to nudge it over the edge of the closet. Suddenly the chair toppled over. Yelled Jason as he fell on the floor. He was holding the bowl upside down above his wet face. Mrs. Jewls hurried to the back of the room. Quick! Somebody fill the bowl with water, she said. Where's Shark? Jason made a face. I swallowed him. The class went crazy. What a show-off, thought Allison. Mrs. Jewls rang her cowbell and told everyone to settle down. You have a bad case of the sillies this morning, she said. She took roll. Who's absent? She asked. Allison, said Rondi. Very funny, Rondi, said Allison. Anybody besides Allison? Asked Mrs. Jewls. I'm here, Mrs. Jewls, said Allison. She sat behind Eric Fry, so she thought Mrs. Jewls couldn't see her. Eric Fry was the biggest kid in the class. Just Allison, said Mrs. Jewls. She marked it on her green roll card. Dameon, will you please take the roll card to the office? Allison stood up. I'm not absent, she said. Dameon took the roll card and walked out the door. Mrs. Jewls, did you just mark me absent? Asked Allison. Mrs. Jewls didn't answer her. Allison marched to her desk. Mrs. Jewls, did you mark me absent? She asked again. Mrs. Jewls looked up. Terence, what are you whispering about? Nothing, mumbled Terence. If you can say it to Jenny, you can say it to me, said Mrs. Jewls. Get off my case, buzzard face, said Terence. Terence, exclaimed Mrs. Jewls. Go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline. But that's what I said to Jenny, Terence protested. Mrs. Jewls, What about me? Allison demanded. Mrs. Jules ignored her. Allison screamed as loud as she could. Mrs. Jules didn't hear her. Allison faced the class. Can't anybody see me? She asked. Nobody answered her. Rondi! Shouted Allison. Dana? Jason? This isn't funny, said Allison. I know you're all just pretending. She stood right in front of Jason, leaned over his desk, and stared at him straight in the eye. I know you can see me, she said. You're trying not to laugh. He stared right through her. She stuck out her tongue at him. He leaned forward, causing Allison's tongue to lick his nose. Yuck! She exclaimed, then wiped her tongue on her sleeve. Mrs. Jules began the morning lesson. Have you gone crazy? Shouted Allison. She ran out of the room and down the stairs and down to the class on the 29th story. Come quick, she said. There's something wrong with Mrs. Jules' class. No one heard her. She slammed the door, then continued down the stairs to the class on the 28th floor. No one saw her either. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Is the whole school playing a joke on me? She wondered. It's not funny, she shouted as loud as she could. She continued down the stairs, screaming anything that came to her head, hoping that someone, somewhere, would notice her. Fish for sale! Fresh fish! Fat fish! Get your fresh fat fish! A tall, skinny lady with very short hair stepped out of one of the classrooms. Shh! She whispered. This is a school, not a fish market. You can hear me? Asked Allison. She was so happy she wanted to hug her. Yes, I can hear you, the woman said sternly. My whole class can hear you. You're making it impossible for us to get any work done. I'm sorry, said Allison, but something's wrong in Mrs. Jules' class. You better come in here, said the teacher. Allison followed the teacher into her classroom. What's your name? The teacher asked her. Allison. Boys and girls, this is Allison, the teacher announced to her students. She'll be joining our class. What? Said Allison. But my name is Miss Zarves, said the teacher. Welcome to the 19th story. Chapter 19. A Wonderful Teacher. Allison was still on the 19th story. The desks were arranged in clusters of 4. Allison sat at a cluster with a girl named Virginia, a boy named Nick, and a boy named Ray. But Virginia looked old enough to be her mother, and Nick looked like he should be in high school. Ray was a couple of years younger than Allison. Miss Zarves is a wonderful teacher, said Virginia in a singing voice. She's the nicest teacher I've ever had. She's the only teacher you've ever had, said Nick. So, she's still nice, said Virginia. I've always gotten all A's. Aren't you a little old to be going to school? Allison asked her. You're never too old to learn, said Virginia. No one ever leaves Mrs. Zarve's class, said Nick. How long have you been here, Virginia? Virginia thought a moment. 32 wonderful years. I've been here 9 years, said Nick. But she always gives us good grades, said Virginia. That's true, Nick agreed. I've gotten all A's since I've been here too. Me too, said Ron, and sometimes I answer all the problems wrong on purpose. Where were you before you came here? Allison asked him. I went to, Ray shook his head. That's funny. I don't remember. I don't remember where I came from either, said Virginia. Well, I do, said Allison. I was in, but suddenly she couldn't remember either. Then it came to her. Mrs. Jules' class, and Rondi was in the class, and Jason, and Dana, and Todd. She named every member of the class, including all 3 Erics. She didn't want to forget where she came from. If I forget where I came from, I might never get back, she thought. Did you say there was a girl named BB Gunn? Asked Ray. Yes, said Allison. BB's a very good artist. My last name is Gunn too, said Ray. I wonder if we're related. Ray, no talking, please, said Miss Zarves. Now, everyone please take out a pencil and some paper. I want you to write all the numbers from 0 to 1,000,000 in alphabetical order. From 0 to 1,000,000? Asked Allison. She couldn't believe it. Don't worry, said Virginia. If you run out of paper, Miss Zarves has more in the closet. Allison stared at her in horror. But it will take over 100 years, she said. So? Asked Virginia. What's your hurry? Allison started to work. It was bad enough having to write all the numbers from 0 to 1,000,000, but she couldn't imagine how she'd ever put them in alphabetical order. 1 came before 2, 3 came after 1, but before 2, 4 came before 1, 5 came before 4, 6 came after 1, but before 3. Don't worry, said Virginia. Even if you miss a few, Miss Zarves will give you an A when you finish. 7 came after 1 and before 6. 8 came first. Allison couldn't think of any number that would come before 8, so she wrote it down. She also knew 0 would come last, if she ever got that far. But then she'd be older than Virginia. I'll talk to Louis at recess, she thought. He'll save me. When's recess? She asked. There is no recess, said Ray. We're not allowed out of the classroom. What about if you have to go to the bathroom? What's a bathroom? Asked Virginia. We don't eat either, said Nick. We just work all the time. But we never have homework, Virginia said cheerfully. That's because we never go home, said Nick. We get a 2-minute break every 11 hours. But don't worry, said Virginia. Miss Zarves always gives us good grades. Miss Zarves walked around the room, checking everybody's work. Excellent, Ray, she said. Very good, Virginia. You're doing wonderfully, Allison. You get an A for the day. Big deal, thought Allison. She had to figure out some way out of there. It was clear that Virginia, Nick, and Ray were all too far gone to help her. Are there any other new kids in the class? She asked. Ben's new, said Nick. She pointed Ben out to her. Ben appeared to be about Allison's age. She was glad about that. When the 2-minute break came, she went over and talked to Ben. Are you Ben? She asked. No, he said. Oh, said Allison. I was looking for Ben. That's me, said the boy. But you just said, my name's Mark Miller, said the boy. But for some reason everybody calls me Benjamin Nushmut. There's a Mark Miller in my class, explained Allison. I know, that's me, said Mark. I'm Mark Miller. No, I mean my other class, said Allison. What other class? Allison thought a moment. I don't remember, she said. After putting numbers in alphabetical order for 11 hours, her brain had turned into spaghetti. Time's up, said Mrs. Zarves. Everyone back to work. Chapter 19. Forever is Never. Allison was still stuck on the 19th story. 14 2-minute breaks had passed. It's dictionary time, said Miss Zarves. Everyone get out a dictionary. Allison found a dictionary in her desk, too. What are we supposed to do with it? She asked. Memorize it, said Nick. But that's impossible, said Allison. No, it's easy, Virginia assured her. You memorize one word at a time, until you get a whole page. Then you go on to the next page. How many words have you memorized? Asked Allison. I'm almost finished with the B's, Virginia said proudly, and I've only been doing it for 32 years. Allison opened her dictionary. Mrs. Jewell's class. She suddenly remembered. She sighed with relief. For the last 6 days she'd been trying to remember where she came from. In her mind, she thought through everybody in her former class. She didn't want to forget again. As she thought about each person, tears filled her eyes. She missed them very much. Even Jason. They were also wonderful in their own special ways. When the 2-minute break came, she talked to Mark again. He was the only person in the class who still seemed to have a brain. "How did we get here?" she asked. "Maybe we're dead," said Mark. "Maybe we died and went to—" "This isn't heaven," said Allison. "That wasn't what I was going to say," said Mark. Allison felt a chill run up her spine. She looked at Miss Zarves. Miss Zarve smiled back at her. "But she seems so nice," said Allison. "Could someone as nice as her really be the devil?" "I don't know," said Mark. "She always gives good grades." "What would happen if we didn't do our work?" asked Allison. "We have to do our work," said Mark. "Why?" asked Allison. "What's Miss Zarves going to do to us? Keep us after school?" "I don't know," said Mark. "Teachers can always find new ways to punish you. They're experts at that." "Your 2 minutes are up, boys and girls," announced Mrs. Zarves. "Everyone back to work." Allison returned to her seat. She tried to figure it all out, but she had so much busy work to do, she didn't have time to think. That's her plan, Allison suddenly realized. She shivered as it all came together for her. Miss Zarves assigns us lots of busy work, so we don't have time to think. She makes us memorize stupid things so that we don't think about the important things, and then she gives us good grades to keep us happy. Miss Zarves walked around the room. "Very good, Virginia," she said. "You are doing so well." "Excellent, Ray." "Good job, Nick." She stopped when she got to Allison. "Allison, why aren't you working?" Allison looked at her. She knew Mark was right. Teachers are experts at finding ways to punish you. And if Miss Zarves was the devil, who knew what she might have up her sleeve? Still, Allison had to take a chance. If she wanted to get back to Mrs. Jewell's class, she had to act as if she were in Mrs. Jewell's class. She took off her shoes and socks, sat on the floor, and stuck out her toes. "Allison, what are you doing?" asked Miss Zarves. Allison took her toe out of her mouth. "Get off my case, buzzard face," she said. Miss Zarves was furious. "Return to your desk, young lady," she ordered. Allison returned to her desk, but instead of sitting at it, she climbed on top of it and sang a song. "I got one sock, looking for the other, one sock, looking for its brother. When I find that sock, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put it on my foot, and I'll stick it in with my shoe." Mark Miller smiled at her and silently clapped his hands. Everyone else looked at her like she was crazy. "Your socks are on the floor, next to your shoes," Miss Zarve said coldly. "I'll give you 10 seconds to put them on your feet. 10, 9, 8, 7. Allison climbed down from her desk. She picked up her socks and put them on her ears. "How's this?" she asked. 6, 5, 4. "Albert Einstein didn't wear socks," said Allison. "Why should I?" 3, 2. Allison closed her eyes. 1. She felt something slam down on her foot. Something else jammed into her stomach. Oof! She grunted as she fell and rolled down 3 steps. "Are you all right?" asked Dee Dee. "Huh?" said Allison. She was on the stairs, somewhere between the 18th and 20th stories. "Sorry," said Ron. "I didn't see you. Dee Dee and I were racing up the stairs, and then you suddenly appeared." "You knocked off her shoes and socks," exclaimed Dee Dee. "Oh, I ripped your windbreaker too," said Ron. "I'm sorry." "That's okay," said Allison. She picked up her shoes and socks. "Race you up the stairs." All 3 ran up to Mrs. Jewell's room. When they got there, they were so pooped they sat with their heads flat on their desk and their tongues hanging out. "Hi, Allison," said Rondi. Allison raised her head. "Hi, Rondi," she said happily. "What did I miss while I was absent?" "When were you absent?" asked Rondi. "Hey, how come you're not wearing your shoes and socks?" Allison hung her socks from her ears. "What do you think?" she asked. "It's a new look." Rondi laughed. "Allison," said Mrs. Jewell, "you seem to have a bad case of the sillies this morning." Allison giggled. Jason entered the room carrying a glass bowl with a goldfish swimming inside it. "Look what I brought," he said. "What's the name of your goldfish?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Shark," said Jason. Everyone laughed. "It makes him feel important," Jason explained. "Where should I put him?" "How about on top of the coat closet?" suggested Mrs. Jules. Jason had to stand on a chair on his tiptoes. He had held the bowl at the very bottom as he tried to nudge it over the edge of the closet. Allison turned around to watch. She didn't want to miss this. Chapter 21, 21, and 22. Eric, Eric, and Eric. Mr. Kidswatter's voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "Mrs. Jules, send Eric to my office at once." He sounded mad. Mrs. Jules was confused. "When did we get a loudspeaker?" she asked. "Louis put it in yesterday," said Jenny. Mrs. Jules was still confused. There were 3 Erics in her class. She didn't know which one Mr. Kidswatter meant. Eric Fry was fat, but not short. Eric Bacon was short, but not fat. Eric Ovens was short and fat. Mrs. Jules chose the biggest Eric. "Eric Fry, Mr. Kidswatter wants to see you." Eric Fry tumbled as he slowly stood up. The other 2 Erics smiled. The principal's office was on the 1st floor. It's not fair, Eric thought as he headed down to his doom. Anytime any Eric does something wrong, I'm the one who gets in trouble. He stood in front of the principal's door. His heart beat very fast. He took a couple of breaths, then knocked lightly. "Enter," boomed Mr. Kidswatter. Eric turned the doorknob. He took 1 step inside, then stood with his back against the wall, as far away from Mr. Kidswatter as he could get. Mr. Kidswatter sat behind an enormous desk. He wore mirrored sunglasses, so Eric couldn't tell where he was looking. "Sit down, Eric," he said. Eric moved to the small metal chair in front of the desk. A bare light bulb hung above his head. Mr. Kidswatter cracked his knuckles. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way," he said. "It's your choice." "I don't know what you're talking about," said Eric. "I didn't do anything." "So it's the hard way, is it?" asked Mr. Kidswatter. "Very well, you'll talk. One way or another. You'll tell me everything I want to know." "But—" Mr. Kidswatter pounded his fist on his desk. "When was the last time you sharpened your pencil?" Eric tried to remember, but he was too nervous to think. Wait, let me think," he stammered. "We had a spelling test on Friday, but I borrowed—" "Where were you yesterday afternoon at 12:15?" asked Mr. Kidswatter. "Yesterday?" said Eric. "I was here, at Wayside School. I remember I ate lunch and then I played kickball." Mr. Kidswatter smiled. "Did you kick with your left foot?" he asked. "No, I'm right-footed," said Eric Fry. "Humph," grumbled Mr. Kidswatter. "Have you ever gotten your hair cut at Charlie's barber shop?" "Yes," said Eric. 2 weeks ago." "Aha!" said Mr. Kidswatter. "So you admitted. Do you know what a mugworm griblick is?" Eric turned pale. "No, please," he begged. "I didn't do it. I'm innocent. You got the wrong Eric. There are 2 other Erics in my class." Mr. Kidswatter scowled. "So that's the way you're going to play it, is it? Well, that's fine with me. I've got all the time in the world." He flicked on the microphone. "Mrs. Jules, send me another Eric." 29 floors above them, Mrs. Jules looked at the 2 remaining Erics. "Okay, Eric Ovens," she said. Eric Ovens shivered. His eyes filled with tears. "Why me?" he asked himself over and over again as he walked down the stairs. "It's my parents' fault. Why didn't they have to name me Eric? Why couldn't they name me Osgood?" He tapped on the door to the principal's office. "Come in!" bellowed Mr. Kidswatter. Eric Ovens gulped, then walked inside. He sat in the little chair in front of Mr. Kidswatter's enormous desk. Eric Fry was nowhere to be seen. What happened to Eric Fry? He asked. I'll ask the questions, barked Mr. Kidswatter. But don't worry, Eric, he said gently. You have nothing to fear. So long as you tell me the truth, he cracked his knuckles. Eric Ovens was very scared. Mrs. Jules always said that there was more than one answer to every question. He hoped he gave Mr. Kidswatter the right ones. Did you have a spelling test last Friday? Mr. Kidswatter asked. Yes, said Eric Ovens. How did you know that? I have my ways, Mr. Kidswatter said slyly, behind his mirrored glasses. When was the last time you sharpened your pencil? This morning, said Eric Ovens. Mauricia accidentally stepped on it and... Did you play kickball yesterday at 12:15? No, I played tetherball. Right or left-handed? Right. Mr. Kidswatter tossed a stapler at him. Eric caught it with his right hand. Mr. Kidswatter scowled. Okay, Eric, tell me this. Have you ever gotten your hair cut at Charlie's barber shop? No, but I will. I'll go right now if you want. You're not going anywhere, shouted Mr. Kidswatter. Have you ever heard of a mugworm griblick? Eric Ovens screamed. Upstairs, Mrs. Jules heard Mr. Kidswatter's voice resound over the loudspeaker. Mrs. Jules, send me the last Eric. On my way, said Eric Bacon. He hopped out of his chair and bounced down the stairs. He didn't bother knocking on Mr. Kidswatter's door. He just walked right in. What can I do for you? He asked. There was no sign of Eric Ovens. Have a seat, said Mr. Kidswatter. I just want to ask you a few questions. Sure thing, said Eric Bacon. He sat in the little chair. He leaned back with his hands behind his head and his feet up on Mr. Kidswatter's desk. He looked at himself in Mr. Kidswatter's mirrored glasses, took a comb out of his pocket, and combed his hair. His hair was very neat and trim. He had gotten it cut yesterday at 12:15 at Charlie's barber shop. Mr. Kidswatter cracked his knuckles. When's the last time you sharpened your pencil? He asked. November 11th, Eric Bacon answered right away. It was 3 minutes before 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I remember because my watch stopped. Where were you yesterday at 12:15? I was in the garden, having tea. Did Mauricia step on somebody's pencil this morning? Asked Mr. Kidswatter. Yes. Whose? She stepped on everybody's pencil, said Eric Bacon. Are you left-handed or right-footed? Demanded Mr. Kidswatter. I write with my left foot and I kick with my right hand, replied Eric Bacon. Mr. Kidswatter scowled. Have you ever gotten your hair cut at Charlie's barber shop? No, I never get my hair cut, said Eric Bacon. I'm bald. This is a wig. Mr. Kidswatter took off his glasses and glared at him. Do the words mugworm griblick mean anything to you? Eric Bacon shook his head. I can look it up in the dictionary if you want. Mr. Kidswatter shook his head. I tried that, he said. It's not there. He rubbed his chin. Okay, boys, you can come out now. Eric Ovens and Eric Fry crawled out from under the desk. Mr. Kidswatter looked at each Eric. One of you is lying, he said. I don't know who it is, but I'll find out. And when I do, whoever it is will be very sorry. Now, I'll give you one last chance to come clean. Eric Fry trembled. Eric Ovens shivered. Come on, let's blow this popsicle stand, said Eric Bacon. He walked out of the room. The other two Erics followed. Mr. Kidswatter rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the white card on top of his desk. On its side, it said, Charlie's Barber Shop. Under that, in blue ink, it said, Eric, Tuesday, 12:15. He turned the card over. On the other side, a left-handed person had written with a sharp pencil, Mr. Kidswatter is a mugworm griblick. And I'll stop the video there, ending chapter 22. But I hope you guys enjoyed the read aloud today, and I hope to see you guys in our continuation of Wayside School is Falling Down. And I hope you guys are having a great day so far. And as always, please take good care and be safe. Bye.